With Disney's release of the live-action version of The Little Mermaid starring Halle Bailey, public interest in the tale has surged. I personally haven't seen the remake, and I don't think I plan on seeing the remake. However, I am a 90s kid, so I'm very familiar with Disney's 1989 animated version. And I recall how many scenes completely and utterly terrified me. I'm telling you, it was trauma. I just didn't know it yet. Those scenes with Ursula, oh my God. And the scoring alone. But with all this talk about the recent live action version that just came out, I mean, not just came out, but it's relatively recent, my personal interest in the 1989 version peaked a little bit. And so I decided to revisit it as an adult. But also, being the history connoisseur that I am, a distinguished woman of class, taste, and experience, I was curious to know how closely the 1989 version follows the original fairy tale of The Little Mermaid. And yes, if you didn't know, the animated film as well as the new remake are based on an old fairy tale. And quite frankly, a lot of Disney animations are based on old fairy tales. And in the case of The Little Mermaid, it was created by a Danish author named Hans Christian Andersen in 1837. So yeah, this story is going on almost 200 years old soon. It's pretty old. Up until my research for this video, I had never read the original fairy tale, but I was aware that it was super dark, and Disney, you know, they did some minor tweaks, some adjustments to make it a little bit more kid-friendly. And really, this darkness is often the case for a lot of fairy tales. I mean, there's some really up shit in some of these stories. And on top of that, the original fairy tale, it's a little bit messier. You know, it's got a lot of propaganda in it related to religion, antiquated notions of what femininity means, being subservient as a woman, and the importance of purity. Oh, and there's also slavery and blackmailing children. So in this video, let's see how closely Disney's 1989 animated film of The Little Mermaid follows the original fairy tale and exactly how dark the original tale was. Disney's animated film, The Little Mermaid, was released in 1989, and it was directed by John Musker and Ron Clements. And it starred Jodie Benson, who was the voice of Ariel, Christopher Daniel Barnes, who voiced Prince Eric, and Patricia Ann Carroll, who voiced Ursula. The music was composed by 8-time Academy Award-winning composer Alan Irwin Menken, and this guy's CV includes some amazing titles like Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, even Little Shop of Horrors. Originally, Disney had planned for The Little Mermaid to be one of their earlier release films, like around the time of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which was in the late 1930s, but that didn't happen. So let's dig into the film. Let's see how much it closely resembles this really dark fairy tale. So in the Disney animated film, we are immediately introduced to King Triton, the king of the mer people, followed by the court composer Horatio Felonius Ignatius Crustaceus.
Horatio Felonius Ignatius Crustaceus Sebastian,
who's one of my favorite characters. What's interesting that I noticed right away is that in the fairy tale, the king doesn't really play a role at all. Like, he's mentioned a little bit, but he doesn't really involve himself in anything. But a character who does isn't even in the Disney animated adaptation or the latest version of it, and that is Ariel's grandmother. She plays a pretty big role in the fairy tale. Also, while we're on the topic of characters, to my dismay, there is no Jamaican crab named Sebastian. There's also no flounder, they don't exist, or Scuttle. There's no Scuttle either, who's also one of my favorite characters. And in fact, nobody has a name in the fairy tale. So for example, Ariel, she's just called the Little Mermaid. First name the, middle name Little, last name Mermaid. But for the sake of time, because the Little Mermaid is much longer and takes a lot longer to say than just Ariel, I'm just gonna call them by their Disney names. At the beginning of the tale, we learned that the grandmother cares for Ariel and her 5 sisters, and she's the one that's actually in charge. And Ariel's sisters actually play an important role in the fairy tale, unlike in the animated film. I believe you only see the sisters like twice. When we are first introduced to Ariel, we learn that she is the youngest of 6 sisters, and she's described as being thoughtful, quiet, but strange. And you'll learn why she's strange very soon. Honestly, the Ariel in Disney is pretty strange as well, but we'll get into it. But they say that she's strange because all of her sisters enjoy collecting objects they obtain from shipwrecks, but not Ariel, which is very strange when you think about the Disney version, because she is obsessed with doodads and baubles and beeblebops and whatever thingamajigs she calls them. She has a complete antiques collection. I'd actually argue to say it's a pretty unhealthy obsession. Now, although Ariel doesn't collect all of these human shipwrecked items like her sisters do, she does have an obsession with life on the surface. And in fact, she would ask her grandmother to tell her tales about her personal experience being on the surface. And so she humors Ariel and tells her about these wonderful stories from her experiences. And the way I look at it is the grandmother is her Scuttle. In the animated version, Ariel would go to the surface to visit Scuttle with Flounder and show him some of the really cool things that she found from shipwrecks to get him to kind of like appraise these items as part of her antique collection. And he would go on to tell her a bunch of bullshit. And now he's got this girl combing her hair with forks and shit. However, unlike Scuttle, the grandmother actually sounds like she knows what the hell she's talking about. And also in the animated version, there's this whole idea that the surface is forbidden from mer people, that Ariel isn't supposed to visit it. When her father, King Triton, discovers that she went to the surface to visit Scuttle for his appraisal services, he gets pissed and tells her to never do it again. But in the fairy tale, this doesn't seem to be an issue at all. There's no concept of it being forbidden. And in fact, it's actually kind of like a reward for the girls when they turn 15. When each sister reached her 15th birthday, she was permitted to visit the surface for the first time. And they made it a whole big thing. You know, they would dress them up, put a cute little wreath on their head, put some clams on them that are apparently really painful because they would clamp on them or something. Now, Ariel being the youngest, she would be the last one to visit the surface. So when her sisters would turn 15 and they would go up and come down, she would wait for them to tell her all of the amazing things that they saw, what they experienced. And so all she has to go off of is the stories that her grandmothers told her and all the stories from her sisters. So she can't wait for her turn to come. And you know what's crazy about this is when I think about the animated version, when her father finds out when she goes to the surface a second time and she encounters Prince Eric for the first time and she saves his life, when the king finds out from Sebastian on accident, he gets pissed. Like, ridiculously pissed. He goes into her antiques collection and he just wipes everything out, destroys all her doodads and hickamabobs. And that scene, when I was a kid, was so terrifying to me.
And it really messed me up.
And so knowing that not only was the surface not really a big deal in the fairy tale, but also King Triton was just chilling in the background doing God knows what. He's not involved really. It's like such a drastic difference. I personally wonder what made them change this whole thing. But that's like one of the biggest differences that I noticed from the fairy tale and the Disney version. So on Ariel's 15th birthday, her grandmother approaches her to let her know it is her turn to visit the surface for the first time. And when Ariel visits the surface, she finds a ship full of merry sailors who are dancing and having a good time. So this part of the fairy tale is pretty much parallel to the Disney version. You know, she goes up there to the surface and she sees this ship, and this is the first time that she lays her eyes upon Prince Eric, and they're celebrating his 16th birthday. All of that is completely like on brand. And then of course the storm rolls in, causing the main mast to snap and the ship to sink. And then Ariel sees Prince Eric drowning and she saves his life. And so when Ariel takes Eric out of the water, she brings him up on the shore and he comes to. Now in the Disney adaptation of this story, I found this specific scene really creepy as a kid. And honestly, I still find it creepy as an adult, and probably even more so. And you might think I'm crazy for that, but I'm gonna tell you why. This is one of those scenes where Ariel just looks completely unhinged to me. I mean, there's many of them that I realized watching this as an adult that I didn't notice as a kid, but this is like one of the top-notch unhinged scenes, to the point where I noticed this one as a kid. Now just think about this scene from Eric's perspective. Pretend you are Prince Eric. You were just rescued by some stranger, even leaving out the fact that this is some mythical fish person that ain't even supposed to exist. And this mythical stranger is hovering over you and just staring really close. So close you could smell their breath. You know, it probably smells like salt water and fish, and it's real hot. Okay, that's a little bit too much detail, but you get what I'm saying. They're over there caressing your face, and then out of nowhere they just start singing. Just singing. Fishy breath, saltwater breath, stranger, caressing. They continue to sing at you from about, 30 feet away on a rock, the only rock sitting in the middle of the ocean within eye distance and ear distance. Like, you cannot tell me that if this was real life, that Eric could not see this mermaid singing and staring at him from that distance. We just gonna sit here and pretend like you don't know who rescued you. It's the creep on the rock, sir. I know it's an animated film, like I get it, but I'm just looking at it from the perspective of if I was Eric and this was real life, how weird that whole situation would be for you or me. So in the fairy tale, instead of sitting on a rock and singing all creepily, a group of girls walk over to Eric, and that scares the little mermaid away. And these girls came from a nearby temple to check on Eric. Now when the little mermaid sees this, she is so happy that Eric has survived. However, she's extremely disappointed because obviously he has no idea she was the one that saved him. When Ariel returns, her sisters ask her how her first time on the surface went, if she had any interesting tea to spill. But Ariel decides to keep her experience on the surface to herself, at least for now. And as time went by, she would visit the surface repeatedly to see if she could find Prince Eric, but to no avail. And it sounds like a lot of time goes by. You know, they describe the environment changing, fruit growing on trees and snow melting off of mountains. It's giving determination or stalking, whichever you prefer. But eventually Ariel would spill the tea to one of her sisters about her experience on the surface and Prince Eric. And her sister couldn't keep no secrets. So eventually all the mer people were talking about Ariel and her obsession with this prince on the surface, until this bit of gossip eventually made its way to a mermaid who for some reason happened to know exactly where the prince lived. Like, she knew his zip code and the full address. So her sisters are able to lead her to the surface to take her to where the prince's palace is. And Ariel would go back and forth and constantly post outside of his palace, hoping for the chance to see him, until she finally does. Here she sat and watched the young prince who thought himself alone in the bright moonlight. That is a direct quote from the fairy tale. That is so creepy. How could anybody not find that creepy? As she continued to watch the prince and other humans, she became more curious over time, and she wanted to join them. So Ariel decides to go to her knowledgeable grandmother for more information. And here we learn from the grandmother that mer people can live for up to 300 years, and that when they die, they turn into sea foam. I don't know why, they just do. And she goes on to tell Ariel that unlike humans, mermaids have no afterlife. It's just sea foam life, nothing else. But with humans, they do have a shorter lifespan. However, they do have an afterlife. In fact, they have what's called an immortal soul, where they get to live forever beyond the stars. Well, Ariel is not with that foam life. So she tells her grandmother that she would be willing to give up her entire lifespan just to live as a human for one day to obtain an immortal soul and live beyond the stars like all the humans. You know, it's interesting how different the Disney adaptation is from the fairy tale when it comes to the reason why Ariel's obsession about humans and surface life comes to pass. In the fairy tale, it's really the grandmother who kind of plants those seeds in Ariel's head. Not intentionally, at least it appears not. But it's these conversations that she has with her grandmother that leads Ariel to do the things that she does. Her grandmother even goes on to tell her that the only way that she can obtain an immortal soul is if she marries a human. Unless a man should love you so much that you are more to him than his mother or his father, and if all his thoughts and all his love were fixed upon you, and the priest placed his right hand in yours, and he promised to be true to you here and thereafter, then his soul would glide into your body, and you would obtain a share in the future happiness of mankind. He would give to you a soul and retain his own as well, but this can never happen. That's the whole thing, verbatim, like from the fairy tale. It's given Adam and Eve McRib vibes. So the grandmother tells her that the only way that she can get a human man to fall in love with her and marry her is if she somehow got legs. To this, Ariel says, challenge accepted, even though that is probably not the response that her grandmother was hoping for, because it didn't really seem like a guide for dummies on how to become human and how to fall in love, how to get a human to fall in love with you. It seemed like it was more of a, this is how ridiculous this is how unrealistic it is to be able to obtain what you want, like a way to kind of dissuade. But Ariel didn't see it that way. She was like, I got the facts. I know what I need to do. Time to get to work. So Ariel decides to visit the Sea Witch. This character in the Disney version scared the bejesus out of me as a kid. And no cap, she still does. Going back and rewatching it for this video, yeah, she still scares me. I think Disney did a pretty good job interpreting the Sea Witch and her appearance as well as her home. Now, she's definitely terrifying in the Disney version, but it could have been a lot worse. When I was doing my research, I decided to look at some illustrations that artists came up with based on what they thought the Sea Witch would look like from the fairy tale. Because her physical appearance isn't really described all that well in the fairy tale. So these are coming from the imaginations of people. And my God, the interpretations. Let's just say it can get a lot creepier than Ursula. Side note, I'm not really sure where Disney came up with the idea for her to be an octopus. Definitely not mentioned as being an octopus in the fairy tale. At least I don't remember coming across it saying anything like that. Now, they do take a good amount of time describing the Sea Witch's home and her entire domain in the fairy tale. And they describe her home being surrounded by polypi and they're half animal, half plant creatures, which I'm just assuming are these little creatures that you see depicted in the Disney adaptation. If you've watched it, you know that these are actually mermaids that Ursula over, kind of like she ends up doing to Ariel. But that's not really the case in the fairy tale. At least they don't say that that's the case. They looked like serpents with 100 heads growing out of the ground. The branches were long, slimy arms with fingers like flexible worms, moving limb after limb from the root to the top. All that could be reached in the sea they seized up and held fast so that it never escaped from their clutches. And as she's going there, Ariel even realizes that one of these creatures grabbed a mermaid and killed it. Specifically speaking, it strangled the mermaid. Ursula goes on to create a potion for Ariel that she must drink tomorrow before sunrise on land. Her tail will turn into legs and she'll become human. But she warns Ariel that the experience will be excruciating. Now, from this point, this is where the tale gets really dark. While Ariel is in this form, as a human, she will constantly be in excruciating pain because she will feel like she's stepping on sharp knives every step she takes. But on the bright side, she will be able to walk with grace like no other, and she will be able to cut a rug like nobody else. Now, Ursula also warns her that she will never be able to see her family again or her home. And there's also a caveat, of course, just like in the Disney version. The prince must fall in love with her, and if she doesn't win his love, she will never have an immortal soul. And if he marries someone else, the morning after their union, she will die from a broken heart and turn into sea foam. And this love between her and the prince to succeed couldn't just be any old love. With this kind of love, he had to be so in love with her that he forgets about his mama, his father, nobody matters but her. And he has to marry her. That sounds like an extremely toxic love to me. Now, there was no time limit on how long she had to get the prince to fall in love with her. And in the Disney adaptation, the threat was that she would turn into one of those creepy plant things if the prince doesn't fall in love with her within just 3 days. And Eric has to give her a true love's kiss. I don't understand what this whole true love's kiss thing, like, how do you even know? What is the measurement for that? Is there a ruler for this? So Ariel swims to the surface immediately to start her new life. She doesn't even say goodbye to her family, her dad, her sisters, her grandmother, and the prince finds her right away after she drinks the tongue witch blood juice. And he realizes Ariel can't speak, and so he takes her to his palace to clean her up. And all the while, every step that she takes feels like a bunch of knives sticking her through her feet. And she just had her tongue ripped out of her mouth. So here, everything seems to line up pretty well with the Disney adaptation, with the exception of the tongue being ripped out and her being in constant pain. Ariel goes on to experience human life, and the relationship that her and Prince Eric build is kind of described like the relationship between a human and a pet. And I say this because they describe the prince as becoming fascinated with her, but it's really in the way that you're like appreciative of your dog or your gerbil or your pet cat. And I say this for multiple reasons. For one, he calls her his little foundling and tells her he wants her to always stay by his side. And he also allows her to sleep at his door on a velvet cushion, in addition to the fact that she follows him wherever he goes. Tell me that doesn't sound like the life of a pet. And meanwhile, she's in unimaginable pain. And when they say that she follows him everywhere, she follows him everywhere. She's described as climbing literal mountains with this man, while her feet are in agony and they're bleeding. And meanwhile, the prince has no idea that she's going through this. In addition to following him, she would also dance for him to entertain him. And sometimes they would enjoy entertainment together. The prince would have his slaves dance and sing for her, as well as his family and him for entertainment. Yes, the beloved Prince Eric had slaves. This is a 19th century Danish fairy tale. Now, as the days went by that her and Eric spent time together, her fondness and love for him would grow more and more each day. However, that love was not reciprocated. In the animated film, Ursula becomes threatened because Ariel is getting a little too close to accomplishing her goal of kissing the prince. And so she comes to the surface in the form of a young woman, posing as the woman who saved him by using Ariel's voice, in addition to doing some hypnotism stuff on him. And as a result, Prince Eric thinks that she's the girl he's been looking for. This is the girl who rescued him. And so he proposes to her. But in the fairy tale, Ariel learns that Eric thinks that the person who saved him was one of the temple girls that came up to him after she dipped out. And so this is the girl that Eric wants to marry. And this just devastates Ariel because obviously she can't tell him that it was her because she doesn't have a tongue. However, Eric can't marry this girl because she apparently belongs to the temple. I don't know what kind of temple it is. It doesn't really go into the specifics of worship or religion, but we do know that she's not allowed to marry, probably some virginal stuff. And so Ariel takes this as kind of a good thing. She's like, well, he might not want me, he might want her, but she's off limits. And I'm around him 24/7, and I got plenty of time. So everything will work out. So she decides to continue to stay by his side always, love him, and devote her life to him. Ugh. That just put a bad taste in my mouth. I need to wash that out. But things don't work out the way Ariel thinks they're gonna work out when Eric relays some really bad news to her. His parents want him to marry a princess from a neighboring kingdom, but he tells Ariel that he has absolutely no interest in this princess, that the one and only girl for him is that temple girl who's completely off limits. And he's just going to visit this kingdom just to appease his parents. And Ariel believes him, foolishly. And what I also find funny is during this part of the fairy tale, this boy has the nerve to tell her, if I were forced to choose a bride, I would choose you, my dumb foundling with those expressive eyes. By the way, dumb back then meant mute. Tell me this boy is not playing games. Now, when they arrive on a ship to visit this princess, she's described as the perfect package. She's beautiful and virtuous and pure. There's a lot of purity type elements in this tale if you haven't noticed already. And even Ariel is forced to admire these wonderful qualities that this girl has. But it gets worse for Ariel because Eric realizes upon meeting her that this is in fact the same temple girl that he thinks rescued him. If I had pearls, I'd be clutching them. Apparently she was not a temple girl. She was just sent to the temple for her education, and so she could marry. On the spot, Eric professes his love for her and proposes right in front of Ariel. And then he has the nerve to tell her, you will rejoice at my happiness, for your devotion to me is great and sincere. And then, in response to this, Ariel kisses his hand.
No.
This is so frustrating. He knew what he was doing. I feel like we can all agree on that. Like, he knows what he's doing. Ariel attends their wedding on a ship and even participates in the ceremony by supporting the bride's train. Can you imagine? And she would go on to enjoy the festivities by dancing and having fun with those up feet. Her tender feet felt as if cut with sharp knives, but she cared not for the pain. A sharper pang had pierced her heart, and she knew that this was the last evening she should ever see the prince for whom she had forsaken her kindred and her home. I'm so frustrated, y'all. I'm so frustrated. So once the festivities end, the newlyweds retire to their tent to listen to some D'Angelo. Meanwhile, poor Ariel is looking off into the sunset thinking about how death is nearly upon her. Super depressing. But then her sisters appear out of nowhere. They tell her they made a deal with the sea witch in exchange for giving her their hair. What she needed the hair for, what she was going to do with the hair, who knows? Maybe she was going to make a cute ass wig.
Hair is everything.
Then the sisters give Ariel a knife and tell her she must stab the prince in the heart before sunrise. She will then turn back to the way she was and live out her 300 years until she turns into sea foam. So with a few minutes left, Ariel decides to throw both the knife and herself into the ocean, and she dies. But there is a bright side to all of this. Well, depending on how you define bright side. Instead of turning into sea foam, she turns into some ethereal spirit, and she learns from other spirits that they are called daughters of the air. And we learn that this is her reward for her selfless act by not killing the prince to save herself. And they tell her she has been granted the chance of a lifetime to obtain an immortal soul by doing good deeds for humans for the next 300 years. Then she will be able to have an immortal soul. Then the tale takes this really strange, abrupt turn where it's talking about whether children are good and bad in relation to the mermaid being able to obtain an immortal soul. So the daughters of the air tell Ariel that she can actually shorten her 300-year sentence in servitude to humans, because whenever she finds a child that is well behaved, it takes 1 year off, and then if she finds a child that is bad, it adds another year. So she could be doing this shit for a millennia if she coming across like really shitty kids back to back. It's just a really weird addition to the tale that feels like the author just kind of was like, let me just add something at the end because I want to make sure that kids are impacted by this in some way. In my research, I learned that the author of Mary Poppins described this as blackmailing children, which I don't disagree with her. And that's the end of the Little Mermaid fairy tale. No happy ending. If you've seen the Disney adaptation, then you'll know that everything is well. Ursula loses and Ariel imprints Mary and they live happily ever after. But in the fairy tale, she not only doesn't get to be with the prince, she also dies after experiencing excruciating pain and leaving everything behind that she knew. And then she has to live out a 300-year sentence, potentially more or less, in servitude to humans, essentially. And there are a ton of narratives pushed in this fairy tale. You've got purity culture, religious propaganda, misogyny, including antiquated notions of what femininity is. But to me, my brain translates this as a traumatic experience of a 15-year-old girl who was subjected to psychological abuse. One of the issues that I struggle with in the animated version is that Eric and all the other humans are just cool with Ariel being a mermaid. It's all good. You're a mermaid. We thought you were a mythical being that didn't exist. Welcome to the surface. Nice to meet you. No, in reality, humans suck. I just don't see it playing out that peacefully. And it sounds like this is, like the 18th, 19th century, or it could even be before then. It really doesn't date when this happened, but we do know that it was created in the late 19th century. So I'm going to assume it was sometime before then. I just see people pulling out pitchforks and Ariel's entire family being hunted down and their body parts sold for profit. Tell me you can't envision some asshole selling mermeat as a delicacy, making bank off of that shit, just so that some rich asshole could say, I ate mermeat. All right, I think I'm going off the deep end here. If you would like to read the original fairy tale, it can be accessed on Gutenberg.org, and I will include a link to it in the description below. All right, that's it. Until next time, bye.